now getting into a lot of people watching this now would have some base knowledge of the Memphis Belle and the B-17 missions. Everybody fixates on that number, 25 missions. But that wasn't a hard and fast blanket solution for everybody. The guys going over there initially, they didn't have a mission count number at all, right?
No, they didn't, and 25 became this truly magic number.
Yeah.
But the first cruise that went over, there was no defined end to their tour. They were just going to go over and basically kind of fly till they die. Mm-hmm. And that's in part why the 25 mission policy was created. But it wasn't just with the 8th Air Force. The Army Air Forces looked at, can we ask our air crew to fly basically until they die? And with some research and thought about it, they realized that there's a certain point where there's combat effectiveness is lost and crews will tail off. And so the idea was that for each Air Force commander, so in this case the 8th Air Force, there were other Air Forces like the 15th Air Force and 12th Air Force and so on, it was up to that Air Force commander to come up with some kind of policy that would define the end of a tour. So that could be a number of months, it could be hundreds of combat hours or flying hours. In the case of the Air Force, or the 8th Air Force, in late 1942, they came up with a policy of 25 missions, and at that point a crew member could go back to the United States. And what's kind of interesting is that what defined a creditable mission or a mission, that actually changed over time. So for the earlier crews, they were advantaged by that because it became a little bit more difficult to get a creditable mission later on. Now this 25 mission policy was later changed to 35 missions further on in the war because there was a need to maintain enough crews in theater, and also too the odds of survival were going up as things got better with fighter escort and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but when one looks at the other nations like Germany, their pilots flew until they died.
Yeah.
In the case of the U.S., maybe in some ways the U.S. had the luxury of doing that, but in addition to ensuring combat effectiveness through the entire tour, these experienced veterans went back to the U.S. and they're training these new crews. So they're passing on their combat experience and making those fresh crews that were going over more effective than they would be, and also giving them a better chance of surviving because they have the benefit of knowledge from these veterans.
Do you know, once, let's just say Joe Blow in the waist gunner seat does his 25 missions and then he goes back home to the US, did they have some kind of obligation or time period they would continue to serve in a training role, or that was kind of like a gray area?
They generally stayed in and they would train new crews. Some of them volunteered to go fly tours again. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that they did that because it was very, very dangerous. In the case of the Memphis Belle crew, 3 of the crew members decided they wanted to keep flying combat, and 3 of them went over and flew in B-29s in the fight against Japan, flying combat missions before the end of the war.
Wow. So we're about to dispel a very widely believed myth. The Memphis Belle was not actually the first plane to do 25 missions.
It's not, and the subject of the first is certainly a hot topic in enthusiast circles, historian circles, and so on. And every single airplane that's called a first has to be qualified in some fashion. So the first U.S. Army Air Force's heavy bomber to fly 25 missions was not in Europe. There were B-17s that were in the Pacific. There were certainly probably multiple B-17s that flew 25 missions, but of course, getting 25 missions in the Pacific meant nothing to those crews because they were still flying. They didn't get to go home.
Right.
So we don't know which one was the first to fly 25 missions in the Pacific.
It's very interesting.
Now going over to Europe, the first 8th Air Force heavy bomber to fly 25 missions was a B-24, which was called Hot Stuff. But what's ironic about Hot Stuff is that it actually flew 1 bombing mission where it dropped bombs over Northern Europe. It only flew about 26 combat missions. It's written that it flew 31. but it flew 9 anti-submarine missions under Coastal Command, not bombing missions, and the majority of its combat missions were actually in the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. So it was on the books of the 8th Air Force, but it flew most of its tour under the control of Coastal Command and then in the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. Now, in the context of the Bell, what would be important here would be the first Army Air Force's heavy bomber to fly 25 missions over Europe.
Right.
And that wasn't the Bell, even though that's said a lot of times. For many, many years, decades, many thought it was Hell's Angels, and I thought it was Hell's Angels as well.
And that's a
It's a B-17 in the 303rd Bomb Group, and it's in this display actually as the first. It needs to be corrected, because when we went back to the records and we looked at every single mission by every bomber in that time period, it turns out that another 91st Bomb Group aircraft, which the Bell was in the 91st Bomb Group, was the first to finish 25 missions over Europe, and that airplane was called the Delta Rebel. And it finished its 25th mission on the 1st of May, and then Hell's Angels finished its 25th mission on the 13th of May. So where does that put the Memphis Bell?
Yeah.
Well, the Memphis Bell was the first Army Air Force's heavy bomber to fly 25 missions and return to the U.S. So all of these airplanes are qualified, but I think, some disparage, well, who cares? It doesn't matter, or this or that. It does, because establishing those facts tells an awful lot about what the crews went through. In some cases, it was just sheer luck, whether they finished a tour or not, because a bomber in formation, and they get hit by flak, and they just happen to be in the wrong spot at the wrong time. No matter how talented they were, they just didn't make it.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting is that the Memphis Bell was not the first bomber picked to represent the heavy bomber crews in the United States. It was actually an airplane called Invasion 2. And there's B-roll footage of this airplane, the crew photographs taken of it, because Invasion 2 was the airplane picked to return to the US and represent the heavy bomber crews. Problem is, Invasion 2 got shot down on a mission against Bremen, against the Focke-Wulf factories there, on the 17th of April, 1943. So had the crew not been so unlucky on that mission, which on that mission, the 91st Bomb Group had 6 B-17s shot down out of 29 in the formation, about 20%. I mean, imagine if you're at work and 20% of the people you work with just are gone.
Yeah.
That's what happened to the 91st Bomb Group on that mission. But it was no fault of the crew. They just were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So the Memphis Bell was really second choice, and had Invasion 2's crew been luckier, then maybe we'd be standing here talking about Invasion 2, and maybe that would be sitting here.